He was a widowed rancher, silent for 5 years, and she was a cast-out Apache woman, left to die in the dust. But when their worlds collided in a storm, what began as survival turned into a love neither dared to dream of. You think you know how this ends, but trust me, you don't. Stay with me. This story will break you, rebuild you, and show you what it really means to belong. The storm rode in on a bitter wind from the north, tearing at the ridges of the red rock canyons above Sedona like an old shroud coming undone. Already the sky was bruised purple with clouds laden heavy, their edges shivering with the faint promise of rain. In the distance, the jagged silhouette of Thunder Mountain cut a stubborn figure against the gathering dark, a silent witness to the wildness descending. Ethan Carver was used to living with ghosts. Forsaken laughter haunted the rafters of his cabin. The memory of his wife's voice faded in the corner behind the stove. He found comfort in the daily monotonies, stacking wood, feeding his old mare, patching the fence line, because they made him forget once more that loneliness had settled in, deep as a wound. He didn't notice the wet footprints at first, or the ragged shape shuffling in the tumbleweed-strewn path. What caught Ethan's attention, instead, was the muted thud of exhaustion, like the world exhaling, and then a human silhouette collapsed by the cabin post. A figure, small and trembling, clothed in rough-spun fabric, torn at the neckline and shoulders, soiled with dust and dried blood. Ethan's old heart, long caged in grief, felt a shock, an echo of something he'd thought he'd buried under years of quiet. He dropped the axe he'd been sharpening and grabbed his lantern, stepping into the cold wind. The storm, for a moment, paused, as if leaned in to hear what would come next. He knelt beside her in the dust. Her skin was dark, streaked with grime, and her dark hair lay tangled across her cheek. Her breath came shallow, as if the wind had stolen her voice. Her chest moved weakly beneath the torn fabric, and the light from the lantern penciled lines of weariness and fear across her face. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly, voice gentle. She flinched, her eyelids flickering open. In those eyes he saw a pain he recognized, not his own, but sharp in its presentness. She looked ready to run, but betrayal had folded her strength down small. Her body wouldn't obey. "I won't hurt you," he murmured. "You're safe." He hesitated, then gently lifted her, cradling her like a hurting child. She didn't resist. She simply sagged into his arms, a rag doll gone limp with fatigue and fear. Inside, the cabin breathed warmth. Fire smoldered low in the hearth, the scent of dried herbs faint in the air. Ethan laid her on the bed he'd made for one. He reached for water and a clean cloth, then returned, crouching at her side. Her lips parted, bone dry. He lifted the cup to her. She drank, slow and wary, as though each swallow was a decision he had no right to ask her to make. "My name is Ayla," she whispered, voice cracked as old leather. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Ethan Carver." Outside, the storm crashed against the roof with sudden force, as if testing the thin walls. Inside, Ayla shivered, breath shallow. Her neckline gaped, a knot of clothing barely covered her. He pulled a blanket around her shoulders, careful not to brush her skin. The tenderness startled him. He rarely allowed gentleness. Too weak, too human. "I'm too much," she whispered, tears slipping finally free. "My people said I didn't belong. My body, my shape, they blamed me." Ethan closed his eyes. He had lived so long alone that he had forgotten the meaning of shelter. Now, it sat beside him in the form of this wounded woman. "You didn't bring shame," he said quietly. "That wasn't yours to carry." She sucked in a breath. He could almost hear the years of rejection crack between her ribs. He wouldn't rush her. He hadn't shared his own past, how grief had taught him to build walls higher than the red cliffs, but he felt it settle between them, an unspoken kinship born of loss. He stood and ladled thick stew, beans, squash, salted meat, into a bowl. The steam curled slow, gentle. He brought it back and offered it, sitting silent. She ate, not speaking, swallowing hard between cautious bites. He left the fire burning, stayed awake listening to the storm's thunderous lullaby, and, for the first time in years, he felt the ache of regret. For walls built too high, for love allowed to die in silence. Beside him, Ayla's breath softened, evened out. She slept. Ethan walked outside when the wind died to a whisper, and the world smelled of wet earth and promise. He stared up at the sky, torn between letting her go come morning or offering what he had left to give. Sanctuary. He didn't know what dawn would bring. He only knew that someone had walked into his life in a storm, and instead of turning away, he had held her. The quiet between light and darkness pressed against his heart like a question. Could this moment be something more? He stepped back inside, closed the door softly behind him, and listened to the gentle rise and fall of Ayla's breath. Tonight, both of them were learning that loneliness could be broken, not with a grand gesture but with a simple act of compassion. And in that compassion, something deeper was born. Ethan Carver knelt by the hearth well past midnight, feeding embers back into life to chase away the damp chill that had crept into the cabin. Outside, the storm had subsided to a gentle murmur of rain. Inside, he watched Ayla sleeping under the quilt he'd draped over her, inhaling the steady rhythm of her breath. In that moment, the silence did not feel empty. Instead, it held a subtle power, like a promise made in the dark. Ethan stood, ladling hot porridge from the pot into a bowl and sprinkling it with a sprinkle of honey. He carried it across the room, the gentle glow spotlighting every stitch in the quilt. He didn't know where she had come from, or where her journey would take her next. And yet, he understood, quite clearly, that his heart had already decided she would not walk away. Ayla woke as he set the bowl beside her. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but within them flickered the faint glimmer of trust. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice brittle, like a twig beneath snow. Ethan gave a small nod, careful not to startle any shred of quiet she'd gathered. He sat beside her, spoon in hand. The porridge was lukewarm by then, but he offered it anyway. She lifted the spoon with trembling fingers and took a tentative bite. A slow exhale followed, relief, comfort, perhaps something closer to hope. They sat in silence, two hearts beating against the backdrop of rain. Ethan wasn't sure if it was the storm's passing or the weight of her presence, but a formidable stillness settled between them, one neither had known for years. Finally, Ayla spoke, voice soft. "They said my shape made them afraid." The words trailed off, heavy with shame she had carried for too long. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, letting his fingers brush hers. "That's cruel," he said quietly. "Not your fault, not who you are." Tears pooled in her eyes, but she did not pull away. The fire crackled in agreement, embers dancing like whispered words of forgiveness. He cleared his throat, searching for the right way to bridge the quiet. "Would you like to hear about a storm I weathered? A wind powerful enough to tear the roof off the cabin?" The edges of her lips curved, a gentle invitation. She nodded. Ethan began. He described a night 5 years ago, when a gale blew into the valley, ripping branches from trees and sending rain cascading through the gaps in his roof. He had fought it, nailing boards shut under the relentless press of wind, hands bloody, heart aching with emptiness. He hadn't known someone could endure such fury without breaking until that night. Now, he understood endurance wasn't only about surviving destruction. It was about being willing to rebuild. Ayla leaned forward, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I thought I was broken too." He shook his head. "Broken isn't kept, it's healed." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't apologize. She simply nodded, breathing through the quiet pulse between them. Thunder rolled in the distance, a reminder that storms stayed, but they did not define the land or the people who endured them. Ethan rose, crossing to the stove to brew coffee strong enough to thaw the coldest dawn. The aroma whispered of renewal. He returned, the mug warm between them like shared warmth. Ayla took a few sips, eyes closing against the awakening tension in her chest. The taste was bitter comfort, something he had forgotten he missed. They spoke then, in embers of conversation. She revealed how her tribe had exiled her for the shape of her limbs, for the fullness that others could see but could not understand. She spoke of nights wrapped in shame, silence like a chain around her soul. Ethan listened, heart aching. He whispered, "I've carried loss too long, but lately I've begun to feel something new, a reason to keep going." He didn't press on the words. He let them sit between them like embers of promise. They drifted again into sweet silence. Outside, the rain had stilled entirely. Inside, walls felt lighter. Someone had walked through devastation into his world, and he had welcomed her without knowing why. As dawn crept through the shutters, Ayla's breathing shifted. More even, more present. Ethan stood to open the shutters, letting in pale morning light. He surveyed her sleeping form, hair brushed across her shoulders, chest rising gently under the quilt's edge. He knelt beside her and tucked the blanket under her chin, cautioning the cold away. Before stepping away, he paused and offered a look, not one of pity, but of deep respect. In her frailty, he saw fierce courage. In her vulnerability, he found his own wounds softening. Leaving her to rest, Ethan stepped outside. The valley breathed wet and clean, colors murmuring beneath morning light. He felt something shift quietly inside him, like settling dust in a room long forgotten. He understood now. Trust didn't gallop in a showy dance. It crept in tiny moments. A shared bowl of porridge. A quilt laid gently across tired shoulders. A murmur of acceptance when nothing compelled it. Back inside, Ayla awoke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of birds hesitant in the dawn. She recognized a new rhythm, the rhythm of shared heartbeats, rising in hope. And between embers and morning light something grew, delicate, careful, a bloom in the desert breeze. The sun had just begun to touch the horizon with pale gold when Ethan and Ayla rode into Prescott. Their horses' hooves crunched softly on dusty street, and the early morning hush held a palpable hesitation in the air. It felt like everyone in town was either asleep or waiting. Ayla sat nervously behind him, one hand resting lightly on his waist, the other shading her eyes from the glare of the rising sun. She wore the blue dress she had sewn herself, its modest collar offering dignity she never thought she could claim again. She looked taut, as if waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong. Ethan felt her fear settle into his bones, but he believed in her now in ways stronger than any words could express. They reached the general store, and Ethan dismounted first, helping Ayla down with a steady smile. She caught sight of her reflection in the dusty window and flinched. She saw the curves she was taught to bury, the fullness she had blamed for so much pain. For the first time, she didn't hide. Inside the store, boxes and burlap sacks stacked high, and the jingling bell announced their arrival. The storekeeper, Mr. Higgins, paused mid-stacking cans and looked at them. Ethan Carver. Wouldn't read your name on any ledger our town had gone dry, he said, cautious. Ethan returned a calm nod. Just need some supplies. Then Mr. Higgins locked eyes with Ayla. She stood tall. He hesitated, nodded. Stocks in the back, was all he said. As they gathered flour and coffee, threads of whispers trailed behind them. Words that didn't need repeating. Strange woman. Rancher's new companion. Ayla's skin prickled, but she breathed steady, shoulders square. Ethan noticed, and every protective part of him clenched. Outside, when they started back home, a woman in a bonnet blocked their path. "You the new cook?" she asked, tone threaded with judgment. Ayla's heart pounded. Ethan stopped and turned. "She's my wife." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, solid, unwavering. The woman faltered, then stepped aside. Ayla closed her eyes, letting the moment settle. It wasn't permission, but it was something else. Recognition that couldn't be ignored. They saddled up again and headed home through the waking valley. Conversation came in whispers beneath western sky. "You were brave," Ethan said softly. Ayla wasn't sure what brave felt like until now. She nodded. That afternoon, she ventured into town again to teach blanket making to the schoolteacher's daughter. Word had spread about her sewing skills. The teacher was surprised, then grateful when he saw what she could their poor family. Word carried that Ayla stitched hope into every rag sewn, and from that day she wasn't just the stranger. She was the woman who gave what she had, art, gentleness, to a quiet schoolhouse. Her name, once a whisper, began to surface in youth's laughter and teachers' praise. Back home, Ethan watched her work under soft light, her hair braided back, hands steady. He realized love was not how one feels in the chest, but how you stand when the world stares. That night, a rider arrived, Sheriff Ramsey, hat bristling with authority. He asked for Ayla, voice polite but wary. "Word is, she's staying at your place," he said. Ethan nodded. "She is?" "She one of them. She's my wife." No bluster, no anger, just a statement. Sheriff Ramsey paused, looked Ayla over, then offered a nod. Then there's nothing more to say. When he left, Ayla exhaled so soft, Ethan barely heard it. She walked to the porch and gazed up at the stars that night as if greeting old friends. He joined her, standing close enough for warmth, close enough for everything else. "It's strange," she said, voice unsteady but alive, "to be seen and not erased." "You're visible now," Ethan replied, "and seen." She turned, and their eyes met. Nothing needed saying beyond that. Being together was defiance enough. Over the next week, Ayla gathered wild herbs and traded stitched leather patches for flour. Little miracles. Neighbors began waving. Children greeted her by name. And Ethan learned something beautiful. Love is claiming peace in public, not hiding it behind doors. One evening, Ayla leaned back against the porch rail and watched him forge a horseshoe. "How did you know we'd be stronger together?" Ethan paused, hammer poised. He set it down, wiped his hands on his pant leg, and met her eyes. "Because I didn't want solitude anymore, and when I looked at you, I saw home." She closed her eyes, leaning her head against his shoulder. They didn't need a vow stamped with fanfare. Their defiance was quieter, richer. Woman and man surviving storms of grief and judgment and finding each other. That night, the valley slept under a sky washed clean, and two hearts rested without fear. Morning came. Together, they fed horses and started fences, sharing silences that felt sturdy, hopeful, enough. When Ayla displayed a scarf she'd embroidered with wildflowers to sell in town, Ethan marveled at how her story had shifted from one of rejection to one of purpose, from hidden shame to shared wonder. Daybreak had broken more than night. It had broken into their lives with promise, courage, belonging. Earlier, Ayla could only hope for shelter. Now, she stood beside a man who chose her, not in defiance of the world exactly, but because she made his world worth standing in. And that was a love beyond judgment, a defiance not of anger, but of hope. She woke before dawn, the cabin dim with the first silver of morning. In the hush, Ethan lay beside her, breathing slow and steady. For a moment, she absorbed the quiet certainty of that breath, the comfort of not being chased any longer. She curled closer, eyes lingering on him for a heartbeat longer than grief would have allowed before. The world was still, but inside her chest, a seed of creation stirred. That morning, she told him in measured whispers that she might be with child. The words landed between them as gently as a prayer, and for a long moment they shared silence that spoke of futures and unspoken tenderness. The loft felt warmer after, infused with something sacred, a promise that defied all their past solitude. They prepared for town again, this time not as souls battered by storms, but as partners intentionally stepping forward into life. Ayla wore the patched coat she had sewn, sturdy hides transformed into warmth and beauty, and Ethan guided the horse with new steadiness. The valley's colors glowed in the early sunlight, as if welcoming them into a new season. They married beneath the cottonwood behind the barn, where Ethan had planted a young sapling years ago over the graves of a wife and baby he lost. It was tall now, its branches slender and hopeful. The preacher's words were few, but carried conviction. There were no guests but the wind and the land, yet vows were spoken, gentle, real, and binding. Ayla clasped Ethan's hands, voice steady. She had nowhere else she belonged. Ethan's heart hammered as he replied that he chose her, wholly and always. That night, they returned to the cabin not as man and stranger but as husband and wife. The quilts rustled softly as they undressed in the fire's glow. They didn't speak. Words were too clumsy to shape what bloomed between them. Something neither had dared hope for, but both now cherished. They simply held each other, the warmth spreading beyond skin and flame, weaving a tapestry of belonging and trust. Weeks passed, each day weaving them deeper into a shared life. Ayla seeded wildflowers along the fence line, her laughter light as petals in the breeze. She hummed old melodies she'd carried from home, weaving them into mornings spent repairing roof shingles and stacking wood. Ethan listened and smiled. He'd forgotten how sound could heal. She patched his worn coat by lamplight, her fingers working familiar movements into something new and stronger. When he watched her, curve of spine and quiet strength in the faint rise of her breath, his heart carved out space in a man who had thought he had nothing left to give. She noticed, too, and her eyes glowed with an open trust she had never allowed before. Neighbors whose gazes once bore judgment now nodded in respect when they passed the cabin. Coily at the general store greeted her as Mrs. Carver without hesitation. He waited for her reaction. She met it with a soft pride that spoke louder than any words could. One evening, Ayla held a candle and stood by the hearth, her pregnant belly round beneath soft flannel. She whispered, "I feel it, new life stirring." Ethan knelt beside her, pressing a gentle kiss to where she spoke. "Our life," he murmured, "our future." It was more than birth or blood. It was redemption. In her eyes he saw the promise of mending past wounds, his grief, her exile, bridges made whole by love that asked nothing but presence. Storms returned to the region later that month, fierce and sudden. Yet in the barn, tucked safely with hay, Ayla rode out the winds in silent assurance. Ethan beside her, arms a frame stronger than any wall. The wind rattled shingles and rattled hearts, but they endured, rooted side by side. Spring returned slow and gentle. The cottonwood budded anew. Ayla gathered shoots of wild sage and thyme, filling the cabin with scent of life and renewal. Ethan watched the seasons pass, no longer just preparing for survival, but planting possibilities, seeds of tomorrow. Ayla's dress, once a patchwork of survival, had become a garment of grace, draped and soft across her growing belly. On a clear morning, she turned toward Ethan, white wildflower behind her ear. "What do we call her?" she asked quietly. Ethan held her gaze. "I'd like to say we'll figure it out. Together," he said, voice thick with something older than love. She smiled, and that simple exchange said everything. They built home from promise, from gentle presence, from the courage to choose one another when both had nothing left but silent hearts. That night, after supper and the cradle put together with careful hands, they lit no lamp. The fire was enough to hold them, and so was each other. Their hearts measured by soft hush and shared breath, they knew this was what home could be. Ayla pressed her hand over his heart. "We belong," she whispered. Ethan molded her closer. "Yes," he said, "you, me, our child, we belong." And the hills beyond their door held witness, not to the ruin of past storms, but to the beauty of love that grew beyond them, quiet and everlasting. Home at last, love that built a legacy. The morning light filtered through the windows, golden and soft, as if blessing the world in its slow rise. Jonas awoke first, stirred by the warmth beside him. Saya lay close, her breath steady and quiet. For a long moment he simply gazed at her, at the peace she'd brought into his life like a gentle tide. She was no longer a visitor, she was home. He slipped out of bed, her presence trailing like a memory. In the kitchen, he built a fire and brewed coffee so thick it smelled like sunrise. Each step felt lighter now, as if life had room for two. He poured 2 mugs, steam curling in the golden morning air, and carried them back to the bedroom where Say stirred, half awake. Her eyes opened, that deep brown softness meeting his gaze. She took the cup, lips brushing the rim with tender care. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," he replied, offering a smile that held everything he'd built over months: loss, healing, endurance, and now belonging. Outside, the land lay calm under the pale light. There hadn't been storms in weeks, not yet, but the echoes of past ones had shaped this place, and the shelter they'd shaped together. Say wrapped her arms around herself, cozy beneath the quilt he'd repair. The curve of her shoulders spoke of something stronger than survival. He reached across and took her hand. "We did it," he said softly. "We built this together." She looked at him, dawn pinking her cheeks. "We did?" she echoed. Love grew here where none was supposed to. Their days had settled into a rhythm, fierce in its quiet familiarity. They planted a garden, rows of corn, beans, and squash side by side. She braided ribbons into sweetgrass to decorate the fence, and he found companionship in the small chores: mending harnesses, hauling water, stacking hay. Neighbors who once whispered now nodded in passing, tipping their hats. Mrs. Thompson at the store smiled with genuine warmth, and when Saya offered to mend the basket handles of a neighbor's daughter, the girl giggled and called Saya Miss Hale without hesitation. At night, they sat by the fire, whispering plans for the future beyond the child on the way. What letters to teach them, how to carve the porch swing, what stories to tell by lamplight. No need for grand announcements. Their shared silences spoke volumes wider than words. One evening, as dusk swathed the cabin in lavender, Sa pulled out the bead necklace she'd placed at Lena's grave weeks before. The delicate pearls and wooden beads caught the firelight, and she pressed it into Jonas's hand. "For our child," she said. He blinked back, understanding. "It'll hang cradle-side," he replied, voice low, "and stay after them." They didn't speak further. No words could do justice to that moment of quiet legacy, from a ragged gift to a symbol of belonging. Winter whispered its way down, weaving frost across the land. Say's belly rounded more visibly by each sunrise. Jonas watched her, heart silent and full. One morning, he came inside to find her sewing hide strips for a new bonnet and jacket, moving with steady purpose. He stopped, breath held. She met his gaze, a question glowing there. "Is this okay?" "It's more than that," he said. "It's beautiful." She didn't flinch as he stepped closer, his hand trailing across her shoulder. "I used to think I wasn't allowed," she said quietly. "You were always allowed," he replied. "More than allowed, wanted." They leaned into each other, echoed in the soft pat of snow against window panes. The world outside melted in that moment, leaving only two hearts gentle and sure, warming each other. Spring returned, fragile and hopeful. The fields softened with green. Sa's labor slowed as the child inside stirred with dawn. Jonas paused his chores to rest his hand over her belly, feeling life bloom there. "This is our heart beating outside us," he whispered. She smiled, eyes shining with wonder. "Our legacy." Time had changed them both. Jonas had found a love that required no apology, just stewardship. Sa had found someone to defy judgment with. Instead of fleeing storms, she could stand calm, not just surviving, but building. On a clear morning, they walked the ridge behind the cabin, the horizon broad and gentle. Say rested her head against his shoulder. "Who would have believed we could feel this safe again?" she mused. He glanced at her profile, set soft in the sunrise. "I would have, once I realized home was more than a place. It's a person." She turned to him, and for a long moment they held each other, breath and heartbeat belonging intertwined, anchored in something tender and strong. They stood quiet, letting the trail of wildflowers guide their steps back. The cabin receded in focus, but their hearts carried the warmth of firelight and quiet promises. Inside, Jonas climbed the ladder to the loft and cradled the bundle of cloth and quilt, laying it in the cradle they'd built together. The bead necklace glimmered in its center. He stepped back, breath catching as he saw not just a space for a child, but a shrine of what love could make. Everlasting. Sa joined him up the ladder, hand resting on the cradle's edge. "They'll grow up feeling loved," she said. Ethan shook his head gentle, smiling just behind wet eyes. "They'll know what some of us waited years to learn, that love can root deep even after the hardest storms." Sa slipped her hand into his, the cradle between them like the promise of tomorrow. Outside, the wind whispered through the sprouting fields. Inside the cabin, it was safe and whole. They didn't say the words. There was no need. Home was not just a place to sleep or a memory of loss. It was forged in quiet nights, in the belief someone was worth protecting and planting love around. Home was where two broken paths wound into one and grew into a legacy, even in the wildest frontier. And home at last became the beginning of everything worth building. At the break of dawn, the valley lay hush, painted in pastel hues of rose and cream, as the morning sun swept gently across the land. Jonas stood upon the porch, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands, the warmth seeping into his morning chill. Behind him, Sa leaned in, her breath steady, her presence both quiet comfort and strength embodied. Between them stood their home, a testament not merely to survival, but to the profound power of hope, trust, and unwavering love born from the ruins of loneliness. Their journey began amid a violent storm that swept through the plains, carrying Say, exiled, wounded, and fragile, directly onto Jonas's isolated homestead. Into a man bereft of purpose and buried beneath grief, she brought resilience and a battered satchel holding memories he would learn to cherish. In the glow of that first tragic night, he saw in her both defeat and a spark worth protecting. She recognized in him a shelter even she'd thought lost forever. Their lives wove together slowly as seasons changed, sharing simple meals over candlelight, speaking shy truths in the hush of night, and building fences under the unyielding sun. Each moment knotted them closer into a kind of belonging neither had ever known. It was a love that couldn't be named at first, arising not from grand gestures but from fierce loyalty and shared silences under starlight. Their neighbors watched with wary curiosity, whispers punctuating their solitude, but Say's steady kindness and gentle laughter dismantled prejudice as they patched reins, helped mend broken tools, and taught children to stitch blankets. Jonas, learning again that courage lives not in defiance alone, but in opening your heart to risk softness, discovered that love was not a weakness, but the quiet architect of healing. When Sa carried new life within her, the cabin expanded with invisible wonder. And on the peach-scented morning their daughter was born, the world inside shifted, sleeping to waking, sorrow to laughter, stillness to warmth. Songs filled every corner, arms, cradled with intention, and the cottonwood outside stretched its arms even wider, as if heralding a season of renewal. Evenings on the porch became sacred, Jonas and Say with hope nestled between them, the boundaries of darkness softened by laughter, trust, and belonging. No words were necessary when your breathing syncs with someone's and you realize in that breath that you are home. "Our life," Jonas whispered once, voice low, as dusk turned lavender and the valley exhaled. Say's smile was the kind born from knowing safety at last. What does this story teach us? Why does it still matter? In a world increasingly divided, where loneliness thrives behind screens and busyness, Jonas and Sa remind us that home is not a place you step into, it is a sanctuary you build. It is choosing vulnerability instead of walls, trust instead of retreat, letting another walk beside you under uncertain skies. This is the greatest courage, to open your door, your heart, your life, and to say, "Stay if you will." In those quiet moments, they teach us the transformative power of presence. Spoonfuls of stew and blankets woven with care become acts of reclamation. Sharing stories, forging connection, nurturing growth. These are not minor gestures, they are the bricks and mortar of belonging, of legacy. And they show us that healing can outlive grief, hope can outlast heartbreak, and love can reclaim the spaces death thought it owned. How does this translate to our lives today? You don't need to leave your world entirely to rebuild your heart. Begin with one thing. Open up, perhaps to someone you've pushed away, someone you've waited for to change, or the loneliness you've grown used to. Begin with a simple gesture, an invitation for coffee, a genuine question, a moment of listening without judgment. That's how trust begins again, in small stretches of empathy, not grand declarations. Build your own sanctuary in everyday rhythms. What would it take for someone else, your neighbor, your child, yourself, to feel seen? A home isn't about bricks, it's about caring enough to let someone stay. And if Jonas and Say's journey moved you, If it reminded you that home is built as much from courage as from walls, please stay with us. Subscribe to our channel, where we bring to light stories that matter. Tales of ordinary people choosing what's hard because it's right, of love mending what time couldn't erase, of homes built not on foundations but on faithful hearts. Your subscription means more than a number. It means saying yes to the idea that compassion, quiet bravery, and healing stories still salvage our world. Your presence in Core ages the creation of more tales that remind us no one is too broken to still belong, and no life is too dark to let light in. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for letting this story echo in your day. Share your own thoughts, your own moments of forgiveness, trust, or gentle courage in the comments below. And join us next time as we gather again around firelight, finding meaning in stories that whisper, "You are seen, you are worthy, and hope is always worth staying for."